Hello, I'm Kads, and welcome to today's video. So the fusion has begun for the community voted champion Vault Keeper Wixwell, and we are looking at a traditional style fusion, meaning we have to collect 16 rares, fuse them into 4 epics, and fuse those 4 epics into the legendary fusion champion. And honestly, I do have to admit that the fact that there's less and less pure traditional style is kind of a good thing, just because these are definitely more of a pain in terms of champion training or just leveling in general, because you do have to ascend them all, you have to level them all, you have to 5-star the epics and whatnot. So it can just be a huge drain on one's resources compared to a fragment summon or even a hybrid style fusion. But of course, the big question that we have to answer is this guy worth going for? And my first take would be, of course he is, because we voted for him. We literally picked all of his abilities, all 3 abilities and the passive. And so since we collectively chose his abilities, I would think that we all would collectively think he would be a good champion in the end. I don't know, community sentiment seems a little bit different on that, but nonetheless, I think he's a great champion. I think he's worth it, and we'll talk through where I think he can be useful. So for starters, he has amazing base stats, much better than we probably would have anticipated. So nearly 20,000 on the HP. He is defense based and force affinity to note. Nearly 1,500 on the defense, which is really important for the A3, which we'll get to in a second. 102 on the base speed, so he's pretty quick. And then he has an extra 20 resistance. Every champion in the game has a base of 30 resistance, so he has a 20 extra resistance, bringing it up to 50 when he's fully ascended. So those of you who were participating in the vote, you will already know his abilities, but nonetheless, if you are tuning in for the first time, or you just weren't around when that was released, then we can go through his kit for you guys. So on the A1, it is a double hitter with a 60% chance when booked to provoke the enemy for 1 turn. However, if the target is a boss, it books all the way up to 100% chance that is on each hit. So he has 2 chances with 100% chance to provoke, which is really, really strong on the A1 if it's against a boss. Obviously, you might be thinking of the Decay Head in Hydra, or perhaps the Magma Dragon in terms of Dune Tower. He can basically solo lock down both of those, that Hydra Head and that particular boss. So very strong A1. Also can be pretty nice in Arena when we get to his passive, where that might come into play a little bit more. We're actually going to jump to the A3 first before we talk about the A2, because there's a little bit of synergy going on there. And this is a 3-turn cooldown where it'll place 2 Intercept stacks on a target ally. And for those who don't know, Intercept is a new buff added to the game with this champion, and it is a take or a spin on a block debuffs buff where it will absorb any crowd control debuff. So freeze, stun, provoke, and even polymorph. So it can block polymorph very, very strong, and it's 2 stacks on the target ally. And stacks means that it will actually stay on there regardless of how many turns that champion takes, whoever that ally is. So if you take turns, it's not going to run itself down. It will stay on you until it gets consumed by some form of CC being placed on you. On top of that, he will also place increased defense and then place a shield on all allies for 2 turns, and the value of the shield is proportional to this champion's defense. So of course you want to build him with relatively high defense, but more importantly, he's placing increased defense before the shield, meaning that the shield will be the maximum size it can be because he has the extra 60% defense from his own buff. So I already mentioned one of the huge pros when it comes to Intercept, meaning that it will stay on an ally until it gets consumed by CC, which is a huge thing. So you're not going to run it out like any other buff, and you can spread it around and stack it up on multiple allies, so you can have potentially everyone in Intercept if no one gets CC'd. But there is also the downside, because it is a buff of sorts, meaning that it can be stripped by any buff strip champion, and I would assume that it could also have its duration decreased by any champion who does that type of buff decrease duration type ability. Now, where a little bit of synergy comes in between the A3 and the A2 is this A2 here attacks all enemies on a 3-turn cooldown as well. 100% chance when booked of placing decreased attack for 2 turns, and it also increases the duration of all ally buffs by 1 turn. So essentially, between these 2 abilities, he can permanently keep a shield up and increase defense on your entire team by himself, and then he also adds decreased attack to the mix on top of the provoke on the A1. So really, really strong. And then this part, to me, it seems like it's bugged, or perhaps they just haven't tuned it perfectly right. But from all the play testing, it doesn't seem to be working as expected. Maybe that's the best way to say it. But it can also increase the value of all shields on all allies, and the value of each shield is increased proportional to the number of buffs which had their duration increased. So in the playtesting that I've seen on the test server, it's not a substantial growth of the shield. So at least for now, you can basically ignore that part of the kit. And so just think of this as a AoE decrease attack, which again is really good. And then increased duration of all buffs, and consider that it synergizes well with him placing a relatively massive shield that is proportional to defense and subject to the bonus of increased defense. So perma shield and then a provoke on the A1 with decreased attack. And when it comes to the passive, he basically has Baradol Fellhammer's passive. So at the start of each round, meaning the start of every wave or as start of one encounter, like a boss fight, for example, he will put counterattack on himself and it will be protected. So that means it cannot be removed. And so if you hit him at all, he's going to counterattack with the A1 and a relatively high chance to provoke, which can be really, really strong. And then at the end of his turn, it'll also place counterattack on him for 1 turn. So basically, he will always have counterattack up unless it gets stolen or stripped or something like that. And he will place it on himself after every single turn. On the aura, we do have defense in all battles by 28%. So it's stronger than the average champion for defense percentage all battles aura. So overall, what do we think of this champion? Honestly, if I had to be fair, I'd still give him like a solid A+. I think he has a lot of potential in Hydra specifically, just because he's a buff extending champion, which is really strong. Decreased attack is nice. He can really lock down the Head of Decay, even though you kind of have to manual him or semi-manual him, like click on the heads on auto if you're running him kind of like a husk, so he can actually provoke the Head of Decay. But other than that, you have increased defense, you have a really big shield, and you have a buff extension for any other buffs on your team, and then the decreased attack. So he's a pretty well-balanced champion for Hydra, but I think you could also see some play in Arena, mainly in Classic and in a Classic and 3v3 Tag Team Arena. I don't think you're going to see much of him in Live Arena, just because you'd have to sacrifice some slot on your team. And considering that we are in the Armands meta, I don't think he's a great counter to Armands. From the testing I've seen, 1, you'd have to go faster than Armands in order to prevent him from placing the sheep. And then 2, once Armands tries to place the sheep on you, he's going to strip the Intercept stacks off of whoever has them. So he could target someone else who doesn't have the stacks on them, and then it will strip the Intercept off of whoever you put it on. So it's not exactly a counter to Armands. However, it can be powered up by the protection set. I have seen that tested, and so you could potentially have a protected Intercept stack on an ally, which again can be quite strong. So are you convinced to pursue the fusion of Vault Keeper Wixwell? Let me know in the comment section down below your thoughts on this champion. Do you agree with my grade, or do you disagree and think he's absolute dog? For those of you who are interested in pursuing the fusion, we can transition over to the lovely spreadsheet, which will be linked in the description box down below, where we can talk about my fusion plan for Vault Keeper Wixwell. So first things first, we do have a pretty standard fusion going on. We have the 4 dungeon split to double Classic Arena, Champion Training Tournament, Champion Chase right at the beginning, which is a little bummer, which we'll get to in a second. 3 Dungeon Divers, 3 Artifact Enhancement, Champion Training Event, and then a standard Summon Rush, which will probably coincide with the Progressive Chance event. We do know that 2x Ancients is starting tomorrow, so that is confirmed, and that will coincide with the Champion Chase. And there's also going to be a 10x for one of the most popular new champions in the game, Otharion Wallmaster, or Wallmaster Otharion. I think that's his name. But anyways, let's talk about the noteworthy elements for this particular fusion, one of which I mentioned earlier, which is that the fact that the Champion Chase is at the beginning of the fusion, which is unideal because that means we can't take advantage of the fact that you can fuse some of the fusion epics for Champion Chase points and use that to offset however many shards you might have needed to use for the particular Champion Chase. And I'm estimating it's going to be somewhere around 3,000 because there is going to be that 10x, as we mentioned, for a fairly desirable champion. So I'm expecting the milestones to be a little bit higher. But again, it's also 2 times Ancients, meaning that is the most accessible form of a Champion Chase for a majority of players. It's the shard that most players have. And so as long as you have somewhere between 60, maybe 80, assuming bad RNG, 60 and 80 Ancients to spend, you're going to be able to get all the points from the Champion Chase. And also, of course, you also have the options of using previous Fragment Summon champions or any of the fixed fusion champions in the game, Broadmaw, Relic Keeper, or anything towards Lady Mikage. The other thing to note is that both instances of champion trading are entirely overlapping with the dungeons, and so you'll just have to make sure that you're budgeting your energy accordingly, depending on which or you're prioritizing for whatever day and how far you're going in each of the champion training events / tournaments. So for me, that does mean maxing both of them out because there's most likely going to be a legendary tome at the end. But if you're just going for the milestones for the fusion rare, it's going to be a lot easier to balance your energy between the two champion training whatever and the dungeon tournament going on. And then for anyone who's not as familiar with the layout of the spreadsheet, over here on the right we have all of the milestones listed for each of the events and tournaments, as well as some of the costs that will go into it. These are usually estimates, and anything that has an asterisk means it is a predicted value, but it's based on historical precedent, so that's going to be within the ballpark of what you'd expect for that event depending on the duration of the event. And then anything that I actually do, I put in parentheses. And so you can see for previous ones like Armand's and Aostrid, for example, I pulled 80 Ancients to get her fragments for that champion chase. Another thing that might be helpful for you guys is that here at the bottom, I've identified my unique or planned energy plan for the fusion, meaning this is how I plan to spend my energy on any given day. And I do put champion training first because that's usually my higher priority because it requires more energy, and breaking up the dungeon tournaments day by day is around 750 points, assuming 2250, which is the typical milestone nowadays for dungeon tournaments. And so I tend to prioritize champion training and then try to get the last 750 points in whatever dungeon tournament is going on. And then of course, because this is a traditional fusion, we do also have to account for the fact that you are going to need some ascension potions to level up the epics and the rares, or to ascend the epics and the rares. And you can see here that for this particular instance, we do have 16 void rares and 4 force epics. And so you can take a screenshot here of what potion, or the amount of potions you will need in order to ascend all of the champions required for the fusion, namely the superiors being for force being 24. So just keep that in mind. And then 12 on the arcanes. Most people aren't going to be struggling with the lesser and the greaters as long as you've been playing for a significant amount of time. You're going to have tons of those. And so that's not usually a problem. But I do want to highlight the fact that they are void rares. And so if you do need to get some void potions, the potion keep dates are also marked here on the main tab, and you can only do void on the void days. So you basically have this coming weekend and the following one to make sure that you have all the potions for the ascending the rare. So just make sure that you don't screw yourself out of getting the fusion because you forgot to do the void keep on this particular day. And the last thing to talk about is of course our supply count and a little bit of the current events going on in the game. I do like to highlight my supply count, namely silver and gems, because I do think people feel like fusions are extremely hard to do, especially back to back, or there's too many too often, etc. But having done all of them, including all of the Titan events, I hope to have proven that, at least if you're in the end game and you budget your resources accordingly, you can do basically all Titan events and all fusions if you choose to. But nonetheless, I do like to highlight the amount of supplies spent over the course of the fusion and Titan events. So we're starting off with around 16 million on the silver and just under 4,400 on the gems. So we'll see where that ends up in a couple of weeks once the fusion ends, and I will post those results in my community tab. As far as the current events are concerned, we do have the end of the fusion warm-up, which was pretty easy, just a little bit of champion training. I basically did that with just the sparring pit and like the daily mission or daily quest to run campaign X amount of times. But we do have a champion training event starting tomorrow, which I'll get back to in a second. Dungeon Divers has already begun. It is a 3-day long one, and unfortunately it is the brutal one where it is 3,700 points. But because there is also champion training, meaning that at least for me personally, I'm going to be running a significant amount of campaign on top of the dungeon tournament that's going on right now, which is Dragon. This should be a lot more attainable than normal given the overlapping circumstances. So that is the divers, and we'll go ahead and just take a look at the Dragon tournament and highlight a bit again of how I approach these things. Champion chase starting tomorrow as well, as it is Friday. But Dragon tournament here, you can see 3 days long, 2250 is the milestone to get the void rare. And as you can see here, whenever it decides to load, is that we are already above the 750 for the day. So we're at 884. So we're above what I would need to do on day 1. By day 2, I would need to be around 1400, and then day 3 get all the way out to 2250. So in my particular case, because I'm already at the allotment for the day, when it comes to the daily accrual energy, stuff like the one we get from the time rewards, anything from these daily quests, advanced quests, I'm going to save all of these energy nodes for tomorrow and just start going ham as soon as possible into champion training and start pursuing that and getting however many points I need for that first day of champion training. And then once reset rolls around, we get a fresh set of more dailies. Then I'll go back into the dragon and try to get that all the way out to 1400 to finish out the allotment for day 2, and then again back into champion training, back and forth. You get the idea. So that is how I typically approach the overlap of champion training and dungeon tournaments. I prioritize champion training if it's the first thing for the day, and then after reset is where I try to make sure that for whatever night that is, I do the allotment of the dungeon tournament. So that's not necessarily a suggestion or recommendation, but nonetheless, I'm just highlighting how I uniquely approach the overlap of champion training and dungeon tournaments. So yeah, that's going to do it for today's video, talking about my fusion plan for Vault Keeper Wixwell. And if you were curious, I do plan to build him in 6-piece protection if I can get away with it for arena purposes, maybe Hydra experimentation, but I think primarily it's going to be for, like I mentioned before, tag team arena and classic arena to, counter some polymorph stuff going on in the game. Once again, do let me know in the comment section down below if you are going to be pursuing this fusion, or if you're not, then let me know why you want to skip this fusion despite the community voting for all of his skills and basically picking the way the champion was going to look. Hashtag no bias. As always, if you did find this video helpful, then be sure to hit that like button down below. And if you did enjoy the video, then be sure to subscribe to the channel for more content just like this one in the future. Thanks for watching and have a good one.